Good evening. The work of reconciliation between First Nations and settler society is a task that must be carried out on so many levels. North Island College, as part of its commitment to reconciliation with First Nations, initiated last year a Kwakwala language class here in the Comox Valley. So as a first-time student, and after 2 semesters of instruction, I'm able to say to you, Gela Kasla, Heyman Dligami Bruce Curtis, Ugwamanabi Community Justice Center, Vayutlan Lax Hum Sulam, Gukwalan Las Comox, Talakwatsuk Evelyn Gillespie, Ikens Noke Lege et Didikwo. But now you can applaud. And for those of you who have not yet registered for the Kwakwala class, I just said, welcome, my name is Bruce Curtis. I'm Chief Administrator of the Community Justice Center. I come from Musqueam Territory and I live in Comox Territory. I'm the husband of Evelyn Gillespie, and it's nice to see you again. Maybe after 3 semesters I can say something a little more interesting. This is the 9th annual Campagnolo Lecture on Restorative Justice, brought to you by the Community Justice Center and our partners, North Island College, Comox Valley Schools, and the Sid Williams Theatre Society. And I would like to acknowledge our special sponsors of this evening's presentation. Our gold level sponsor is the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, and our 2 bronze level sponsors are the Comox Valley Community Health Network and the Makola Housing Society. We have received regrets due to illness, the sitting of the legislature, and other scheduling problems, but they've all expressed their incredible expressions of support for these lectures, and we've received those blessings and greetings from Gord Johns, MP for Courtenay Alberni, the Honourable John Horgan, Premier of BC, the Honourable David Eby, Attorney General, the Honourable Melanie Mark, Minister of Advanced Ed Skills and Training, the Honourable Scott Fraser, Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, Ronna Ray Leonard, MLA for Courtenay Comox, Parliamentary Secretary for Seniors, Jesse Kettler, Chair of the Board of Comox Valley Regional District, His Worship Russ Arnott, Mayor of Comox, the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould, MP for Vancouver Granville and former Minister of Attorney General, and the 7th Campagnolo Lecturer, and John Bowman, President of North Island College. This year's Campagnolo Lecturer will be introduced to you shortly, but I just wanted to say it's a real honor for the CJC, our work, and the Comox Valley in general, that he accepted the invitation to deliver the 9th annual Campagnolo Lecture. And when he was directed not to undertake travel by his physicians, he was graciously set up the video link so that he could still participate with us this evening. When I was in school, being labeled a disruptor by your teacher was not what Martha Stewart would call a good thing. But in the intervening years, the meaning of the word disruptor has shifted dramatically, and now has the flavor of a respected term of honor. Senator Murray Sinclair has, over a lifetime of work, clearly earned the honor of being labeled a disruptor, but in this new good way. His work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission could hardly be called anything less than disruptive. And now I would like to invite Katherine Frank, Councillor of the Comox First Nation, to extend the official welcome to the traditional territory of the Comox First Nation.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here to welcome all of you to the unceded and traditional territories of the Comox and Penelach people. My Comox name is Ojai and my English name is Katherine Frank. I'll just speak to you in English so that all of you can understand. Senator Murray, thank you for being participating with us tonight. Chief Nicola Rempel sends her regrets. She has another commitment with her children, so I don't want to take over the stage, but sometimes this happens when you give an Indian a microphone, a platform, and a voice to to talk to. So thank you. But I thought it was important to share who I am as a person, just a tiny fraction of who I am. I'm a Comox, of Comox descent. I'm from the Penlatch. I'm from the Numgees, the Quagil, the Kwikwasutnuk, the Zaudanok, the Homalco, the Tlingit, and I'm related to everybody up and down the coast about 5 different ways. So I wanted to share with the local community tonight some of the Aboriginal issues that will be discussed tonight, and with Senator Sinclair, that those issues aren't just here in the Sid Williams Theatre, they're not just here in the Comox Valley, but they're all across Canada. On a personal note, I just want to let you know that my mom's grandfather was Dan Cranmer, and he was arrested in 1921 in Village Island for potlatching. He was sent to the Ocala prison, where he is forced to feed pigs because he refused to give up his regalia and he refused to give up his rights as an Indian chief. And he, at that time, was opted to go to jail, and he refused to give up where many of the other people gave up their regalia, where all of those where the artifacts and the rights remain in museums and with private collectors. On my mom's side of the family, on her maternal side of the family, my mom's granny was the late Effrey Johnson, or Effrey Pearson, and she was also born into a family of chiefs. At a young age, she had an arranged marriage, and as a result, had my beautiful late granny, Caroline. My granny Caroline and Jody Wilson-Raybould's father, Bill Wilson, are brother and sister. And my granny Effrey buried 3 of her children long before she ever passed away, due to murder here locally in the 60s, where her partner, a non-native, had murdered her. 1, 2, an unforgiving lifestyle, and my Uncle Cal, who killed himself in my granny's yard adjacent to the Comox golf course. And this all happened between the 60s and the 80s. My dad is the hereditary chief of the Comox and Penlatch people. My dad's dad was Norman Frank, and he had attended their school, the residential school at Cooper Island, and left there in grade 2 when he recognized that his younger brother had died there. My mom also went to residential school in Port Alberni. My mom's parents attended the day school in Alert Bay, and my grandparents suffered at residential school. Now I'd like to talk about the nation of Comox. In 1864, it was noted by Robert Brown, an explorer, that the Comox population was about approximately 50 people, and there was only about 10 people at that time from the Penlatch. Prior to contact with the white people, there was a wide range of evidence that the Comox and the Penlatch people were a thriving people that worked together, that worked hard, and maintained 200,000 to 300,000 fish weirs just downriver from here in the Comox estuary, in the Comox harbor, and along Royston. Today, our band membership is made up of 347 status Indians with an exogamy rate of 89%. To address the issue of phasing out the status Indian, it's important that the Comox people retain their identity, we protect our rights, we protect our title, and we protect our people. And we're gonna have to do this through a treaty process, as status Indians in our nation are becoming phased out all on our own. Today, the Comox First Nation is in stage 5 of stage 6 of the treaty process and have been in negotiations for over 20 years now. So we are striving hard to work with all governments to come to a successful treaty, and so we're hoping for the best. And it's a long, arduous task to deal with the governments that don't understand our people. However, through events like this, through events through the Comox Valley Community Justice, through Sid Williams Theatre, this gives us an opportunity to share who we are. This isn't to blame anybody. This isn't to shame anybody. It's simply to give an awareness of Aboriginal people right here, right now. So I just wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to give some context of who we were as a nation. And this is a large part of reconciliation. So I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. I want to thank Janet Fairbanks, Wayne Bradley. I want to thank the Comox Valley Community Justice, and especially all of you for coming and attending here tonight. I would also like to thank Senator Sinclair. I'm sorry that you can't be here tonight, but I see your face on the computer in front of me, and I really appreciate that the work that you do for truth and reconciliation on behalf of me, my family, and all the Native people all across Canada. I appreciate the work that you do. I appreciate the truth tellers, and I appreciate that there's a common understanding with telling the truth and who we are and sharing that information and reconciling the differences so that we can move forward and support each other in a healthy way that makes us all grow prosperous as Native people and as Canadians. So thank you very much.
Now I would like to invite Sheila McDonald, Vice President of the Community Justice Center and the Area A Trustee of the School District, to give the Community Justice Center's official welcome to this year's Campagnolo Lecture.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Katherine. You really highlight the hard work, understanding work to be done. Thank you. Good evening, honored guests, community leaders, and so many friends. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Justice Center, and as a stand-in for our president, Heather Ney, who was not able to be here. I'm just very happy to welcome you to the 9th Annual Iona Campagnolo Lecture in Restorative Justice. It's a real pleasure to see such a large and diverse audience for this year's lecture celebrating the restorative work of the Honourable Dr. Murray Sinclair, Senator for Canada representing Manitoba. I give special acknowledgement to a number of Comox Valley leaders who've joined us this evening. Rachel Blaney, MP for North Island Powell River, Chief Darren Blaney, Homolko First Nation, Katherine Frank, Comox First Nation, their worships, Bob Wells and City of Courtenay, Leslie Baird, Village of Cumberland. And I'm trusting that you're all out there because I'm going by a list that I can't see you out there, but I know there are many others as well. Patricia Trasolini, on behalf of Jane Murphy, Chair of the North Island College Board of Governors, Roger Kishi, Aboriginal Housing Management Association, Nick Chowdhury, co-chair of the Community Health Network, local staff from Macola Housing Society, Janice McDonald, President Mikisu, Métis Association on behalf of Michael McDonald, the Vancouver Island Regional Director of the Métis Nation, Deputy Wing Commander Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Daw, representing Colonel Poitras, the 19th Wing Commander, CFB Comox, Dr. Neil Cruikshank, Dean, Art, Science and Technology, North Island College, and Dr. Evelyn Voyager, Elder in Residence at North Island College. The Campagnolo Lectures are the premier event of the CJC's annual calendar of events and the highlight of our work in public education around the issues of restorative justice. The CJC has been working for many years to bring resolution and reconciliation to people of the Comox Valley. And this year we're celebrating our coming of age. We're 21 years old. We've been delivering service to the community for all that time. As a community-based, volunteer-run organization, we're proud of all that we've been able to accomplish. This year, we've invited as our lecturer, Dr. Murray Sinclair, a national leader in seeking justice for First Nations, the former Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now a senator representing Manitoba. Restorative justice is the very heart of what we do. Across every aspect of our wide-ranging program of work, we use restorative justice principles to bring harmony to our community by bringing those in conflict to a place of reconciliation. Whether it be a young person who needs to learn accountability for poor decision, an adult in conflict with the law, victim of elder abuse, or one whose life has been seriously harmed by an incident involving racism, hatred, or homophobia, The CJC's programs have immense capacity to begin the healing process and restore peace. As an organization, we have over 150 residents of the Comox Valley who diligently serve as dedicated volunteers to this work. And so, on behalf of all of us at the Community Justice Center, welcome to the annual Campagnolo Lecture. Now I'd like to call on Neil Cruikshank, Dean of Arts, Science and Technology at North Island College, and Ian Hargraves, representing Comox Valley Schools, who are our partners in this project, to welcome you on the behalf of those organizations.
Great, thank you. Good evening. On behalf of John Bowman, President of NIC, and the whole North Island College community, I am delighted to welcome all of you to this year's Campagnolo Lecture in Restorative Justice. The annual lectures are co-presented by the Community Justice Center and North Island College. NIC is very proud of this relationship with this CJC and our association with the Campagnolo Lecture. The lecture has become a premier event on the Comox Valley's annual community calendar. In 2018, NIC and the CJC formalized in writing our joint commitment to the annual lecture. Through this partnership agreement, the college increases financial and in-kind support for the lecture series, which we hope will contribute to its success for many years to come. I want to take this opportunity to recognize the work of the CJC Board, Chief Administrator Bruce Curtis, and the more than 150 volunteers that provide restorative justice services in our region. They're doing a fantastic job. Seated among us today are many special guests. From North Island College, I would like to acknowledge members of the Board of Governors, faculty, staff, and the many students in attendance this evening. Tonight's presentation by the Honourable Senator Murray Sinclair is sure to be informative and thought-provoking, and I am very much looking forward to it. I would like to thank the Senator for sharing his time and thoughts with us this evening. We appreciate it very much. Once again, on behalf of everyone at North Island College, thank you all so much for attending this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Good evening. I too would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Comox First Nations, and I would thank them for that. It is with humble pleasure that I deliver the welcoming acknowledgement from the school district to an audience here tonight to listen to Senator Murray Sinclair, a remarkable individual who served as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In our community, indeed, in our school district here in the Comox Valley, reconciliation and the 94 recommendations are impacting lives of students every day. Our Board of Education built a robust strategic priorities plan to include the goal of deepening our integration of Indigenous ways and knowing. We recognize and embrace the responsibility as educators and as Canadians to build respectful relationships, and we begin by bringing the rich Indigenous traditions and culture of this region into the classroom in as many creative and imaginative ways as possible. Through art, storytelling, drumming, and dancing, to learning the language of the Kwakwala, and enriching our partnership with the Comox First Nations, our students from as young as kindergarten through to grade 12 are receiving an enriching learning experience. We commissioned our own school district song, Amamalasake Kumaksa, that speaks of our great land and culture. We became the first district in the nation to fully sign on every school to the Downey Winjack Legacy School program. Fortunate we are to have an Indigenous education team of Indigenous support workers and an enriching elders and residents program to help us along the journey of reconciliation. So to you, Senator Murray McClare, welcome to the Comox Valley, home of the legend of Quinish. Thank you.
And now, as a special presentation, we have the Vice President of the Community Justice Center, Sheila McDonald, to make a presentation to our speaker this evening.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you. And Bruce here is going to show through the airwaves the gifts that we are so happy to present in honor. Ladies and gentlemen, it is part of the tradition of the Community Justice Center to honor those who have championed making things right in our community, the province, country, and internationally. I'm fortunate to announce that the latest person that the CJC has elected as a fellow of the Community Justice Center is an honoree who meets each and every one of those criteria, our 9th Iona Campagnolo lecturer, Senator Murray Sinclair. Senator Sinclair is renowned for his leadership of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and particularly for the final report with its 94 calls to action. Election to this fellowship is an expression of the Justice Center's appreciation of his leadership and influence in promoting reconciliation with First Nations, and for his extensive work to repair the relationship between settler society and Indigenous communities across Canada. His career within the law and judiciary has led inexorably to change and improvement in the lives of First Nations. As Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he brought new, supportive approaches to the practice of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. He's a national champion of making things right in our relationship with First Nations and has laid out the paths to be pursued in so many areas of that work. Senator Sinclair, on behalf of the Community Justice Center, I'm pleased and honored to advise you that you have been elected to an honor of the CJC, and I hereby induct you as a fellow of the Community Justice Center. It feels a bit like the Lord of the Rings or something, but thank you.
It is the practice of the Community Justice Center to present our elected fellows with this. Can you see this, Senator?
I can.
Oh, perfect. This is a print, a limited edition print that we commissioned in 2009 to give as a witnessing gift to all those who signed our first critical incident response protocol against racism, hatred, and homophobia. And it was specially designed by a Comox First Nations artist, Andy Everson, and we kept the oversupply of them, and we do present them to each of our elected fellows. So this is a very special honor. If you were physically here, you'd be able to go around to lots of offices in the Comox Valley and see a copy of this print on their walls, because they hold them up proudly, and this will be sent to you. At the graduation feast of my last day of my Kwakwala class in North Island College last December, Yvonne Savoie called me aside and asked if it would be possible for him to give one of his carvings to Senator Sinclair at this event. We discussed what he had in mind, and I was thrilled to be able to say yes to the incredibly generous offer and the deep respect for Senator Sinclair's work that was behind this gesture. Yvonne has been a practicing carver and Indigenous artist for many years, and on that basis he was invited to prepare a broken copper to serve as the symbolic piece at the opening of the Potlatch 6767 art exhibition. Hiltsa Tatam, the copper will be fixed. The broken copper made by Yvonne for that exhibition sat at the entryway, reminding visitors that the broken copper symbolized broken trust in need of repair. A full and complete copper is the sign of wealth for its owner and documents right relationships among the people. A broken copper ceremony carried out to shame an individual who was not living in right relationship was recovered by Namgas artist Obo Dick at both the provincial and federal legislatures in 2013 and 2018. Dick explained that he hoped that the broken copper would touch the conscience so people would start caring more and work towards creating a world of well-being for all of our children and our mankind. So now I turn it over to Dr. Evelyn Voyageur and Yvonne Savoie for their presentation.
Gila Kestagla, Oleg Almulas Gnokache, Gnokache, Oskada, Yahegas and Slawenum Lacho, Sinclair. It is with great honor that we're presenting this to you. And my husband made this. And I just want to say this. My husband was adopted into the Guaweino tribe. So nobody can say that he doesn't have the right to do this, because he was adopted and named in Chief Robert Joseph's potlatch. So I will read the meaning of the copper to the Kwakwala speaking people. The copper represents the traditional land, water, and air, which we have been given the responsibility and obligation to protect and take care of. This includes all living beings, whether they swim, walk, fly, or grow out of Mother Earth. The copper also gives us our voice to speak and the authority to carry on our traditional and spiritual practices. The symbols seen on the copper are usually the power animals such as the eagle, wolf, whale, thunderbird, raven, sea seal, or bear, all of which represent the spirit of the land. Commonly, the design of the bottom of the copper is the tree of life, the great cedar tree. The cedar tree clothes us, feeds us, transports us, and gives us the medium we use to carve our masks for our sacred dances. The copper is a symbol of our wealth in all that we are, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. In our potlatch is a symbol of what we give and not what we have. So I think it's very befitting that we give this to you for all the work you have done in the TRC, and that we will continue to do it. But I want to tell you something. I've been with North Island College, working there, going on to 15 years. And they asked me to come and work with them because the nursing program was going to change its curriculum to be inclusive. So the day that the recommendations came out, my coworker, Joanna, said to me, she emailed me and said, "Have you seen the recommendations, Evelyn?" We have been doing it. So the nursing program has been doing it before the recommendations. We were just ahead. So, so from the bottom of our hearts, I know that many, many of the First Nations people thank you for all the work you have done. Gila Kesla.
Mr. Sinclair, you are all what this copper represents. And the world is watching you, and you're number one on the list as a recipient of this little plaque. And hopefully we will be able to donate to other people that are carrying on your work. So thank you very much for being here this evening.
And I'm going to put it in a black bag. And the black bag design is the raven. And I am from the Raven clan of the Zawadeno. So it will go with the...
And now we have come to the point of doing the introduction to our speaker, and we invite the patron of the Community Justice Center, the Honorable Ms Campagnolo, to join us on stage to do the introduction.
Thank you so much, distinguished leaders, citizens of this community. I'm sure you join me in expressing our respect to the Comox First Nation and the three clans and all its peoples, and also our three communities and all our members. We are fortunate, beyond fortunate, to live, I think, in BC. Whew. Something I always say we're the elephant burial ground of Canada. Distinguished leaders of the community, I acknowledge with respect the Comox First Nation, and I would like to say at the outset, the Honorable Dr. Murray Sinclair is an independent senator representing Manitoba, where it's 2 hours later than it is here. And this is the 9th lecture in our series, and the senator's Ojibwe name is Mizenegaziki. Pretty close. Thank you.
Pretty close.
My Tsimshian name is Nolswiner, mother of the Big Fin, from Chief Hakbakotu of Hazelton, beside Mount Stekiaden. As Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada from 2008 to 2015, Dr. Sinclair, his commission investigated the impacts and the consequences of Canada's Indian residential school system. The final report, titled Honoring Truth and Reconciling for the Future, included a set of powerful calls to action. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has committed to implementing all 94 recommendations. During his term as Chief Commissioner, Dr. Sinclair led an active multi-million-dollar fundraising program to support various TRC events and activities, as well as to provide assistance to survivors for travel costs to attend the TRC meetings. Dr. Sinclair had served in many senior capacities in his home province of Manitoba prior to his Senate appointment, which was made 10 months after the final report had been brought forward. Senator Sinclair had long had an honored and distinguished service to the law and to First Nations throughout his early life. And he has won many awards, and I won't list them all for you, but some of them are the National Aboriginal Achievement Award in 1994, Inspire's Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Manitoba Bar Association Equality Award in 2001, the Distinguished Service Award in 2016, the President's Award from the Canadian Bar Association in 2018, the Peace Patron Award from the Mosaic Institute, the Tarnopolsky Award for Human Rights from the International Federation of Jurists in 2017, the 2019 Simons Medal for the Confederation Center of the Arts, and the Meritorious Service Cross of Canada. Our Community Justice Center has welcomed Dr. Sinclair with a fellowship. In addition to the Justice Center's commitments to support all efforts to make reconciliation with First Nations a reality, we're also committed to combating racism and hatred and homophobia. In the light of recent events here and across Canada, these two concerns were recently dreadfully combined here in the Comox Valley. In 2009, the Community Justice Center led the Comox Valley in a process to develop and implement a critical incident response protocol to combat racism and hatred and homophobia in our community. In 2016, the protocol was revised to address a visible rise in online racist and hateful commentary. As a community, the Comox Valley's 127 political leadership and community organizations came together and became signatories to this protocol. They committed to standing up and taking actions when encountering acts and comments that were intended to divide us. When our community needed to address the social media fallout from recent blockades erected in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, the chair of the regional district and the mayors quickly met and issued a call for the racist and social media attacks to cease. We heard the blockade had experienced confrontation. Then social media erupted with hatred and vitriol in response. So that was really our main concern. This was from Regional District Chair Jesse Kettler. Then Courtenay Mayor Bob Wells said, we have a protocol agreement, so when something like this happens, we have a process to follow, and a part of that process is calling out those people who are acting in bad faith. From the House of Commons, one of our local members, Rachel Blaney, addressed the issue saying, I'm calling on all people not to be silent, but to remind one another that we can have a difference of opinion, but we should not spread hate. Chief Nicole Rempel of the Comox First Nation spoke of the blockades. They're disappointed that the Comox name was used without their knowledge or consent. Chief Rempel said it was organized by non-Indigenous Comox Valley residents who aren't connected to their territory and no way represent the Comox people or their values. She added, it is saddening to see racist comments in social media aimed at our community when Comox was not involved. Extinction Rebellion Nanaimo subsequently issued a press release saying we feel it is necessary to offer a public apology for unintentionally misrepresenting the Comox First Nation. We will do whatever is necessary to make amends for this mistake. And we remain in a deep state of regret, they said, for any possible harm to the Comox First Nation. They went on to say, we would like to urge all citizens to be aware of their biases and to look deeper at the implications of sharing misinformation. These actions on behalf of the Comox Valley and the Comox First Nation exhibit a full commitment to the Justice Protocol with its calls for ending racist hatred and hate-filled actions. The Justice Center's membership is proud of their actions. We're all grateful for the support of the community towards promoting restorative justice actions that help to protect and create peaceful communities. As for me, I have been asked many times about my feelings in regard to the advances being made and to the regression being experienced. I have to tell you, first of all, British Columbia and the Wet'suwet'en and Canada have resulted in what I call a Smithers arrangement. we don't know yet whether or not it will be ratified. I know the matriarchs of the Wet'suwet'en are at work, and I salute them. Sigadameneak. However, it is now 38 years since nation building stopped when work on Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution Act was suspended without defining Aboriginal rights and title. Section 35(1) says only that existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed, and Section 35(2) of this Act states Aboriginal peoples of Canada include Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. There were no BC treaties. The 1997 Supreme Court Delgamor Decision, brought by the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en First Nation, resulted in oral histories being included in negotiations. Approving oral histories for inclusion was a major step. But of course now I'm a very old lady, and I remember, and I think of Frank Calder standing up and being heard, the Niska, one of the first oral histories that was heard in court. Then there was James Gosnell and later his brother Joseph Gosnell, who carried that treaty forward. And they led the Niska Nation into Canada as the first modern treaty in 2000. Clearly, it is time now to negotiate a fair and just definition of rights and titles, to create conditions for inclusion of the inherent right to self-government, and for the real founding mothers and fathers of Confederation to take their place at the table, and perhaps someday as a fourth order of Canada's government. But of course, Senator, you know, are you still with me? You know, everything takes time and lifetimes. And the Senator's work is our work also. We're honored to welcome and thank him for his steadfast commitment to justice over such a long and distinguished career. For the 9th Community Justice Center in my name, I am so proud to be able to introduce you to Senator Murray Sinclair.
Those final words of introduction from Iona really struck me, and I was making a note when she asked if I was still with her. I was just making a note saying, it's such a wonderful introduction that all I really can do after this is say, me too, ditto. She really said a lot of very important things that I truly appreciated hearing. And I want to thank her for that warm introduction. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Comox First Nation and the clans and the people of the First Nation and their territory, and for allowing this event to be held here. I particularly just want to acknowledge Katherine, who commented at the beginning, and tell her that her story touched me very deeply. It was similar to many stories that we heard during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was a little overwhelmed by it. So I just want to thank you for doing that, for sharing your story that way. I'd also like to acknowledge the presentation of the items that have been given to me, the certificate the wonderful print and the carving of the broken copper and the story behind it. And to all of you, I give my heartfelt thanks. It's very important. Exchanging of gifts and acknowledging of gifts is a very important part of all of our traditions. And I was extremely touched by the fact that you made that effort to do that, and I appreciate that as well. So, where do I begin? They told me that I have about 10 minutes, but I think I'm going to take a little bit more than that. I want to talk a little bit about the TRC and the background to it, so that you can understand the calls to action. I want to talk a bit about the calls to action, and I also want to talk a little bit about what life is like in the Senate, so that you can get an appreciation for the kinds of hurdles that we have yet to overcome. So let me begin by saying that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its processes were very demanding, were very difficult. I know that many people have acknowledged that it must have been a difficult thing to listen to the stories and to listen to the presentations that were made by the survivors, and it was. It wasn't difficult in the sense of feeling that I was listening to people who were lost or who were damaged. It was difficult for me to listen to the fact that this country had done what it did, because I grew up loving this country. I grew up really believing that Canada was a wonderful place. I went to law school in order to work for the legal system, or work within the legal system. And so during the TRC process, by the time I started it, I had an appreciation for the fact that law had been used as a tool of oppression, but the impact of it on the daily lives of people was magnified by that experience. And so I can't say that I was disillusioned. In fact, I was inspired by the survivors to believe that something has to be done about this, and something important has to come out of this. And that's what they were looking to the TRC to do. And I hope that in some ways, at the end of the day, we can say that we have done that. But those of you who followed the TRC will remember that when we delivered the final report in December 2015, I made an announcement then, and that announcement was that I was not going to continue in public life anymore, that I was going to step back and devote the rest of my life to my family, because they had given up so much in order for me to be able to do the work that I did. And I had also had to put their needs and wishes and our relationship aside a bit during the time of the TRC, but also during the other projects that I was involved with. And I knew that we needed to do some rebuilding. We needed to catch up with each other. And so I announced that I was stepping back from public life, and that I was going to retire from the TRC. I was also going to retire as a judge, and I was going to dedicate my life to my wife, Katherine. And so shortly after the end of the TRC, when we had finished closing down the office and all of the systems that go with it, I retired from the court and then started my retirement. And that I retired on January the 31st of 2016. And then on February the 8th, Trudeau called. So he asked me, of course, if I would accept an appointment to the Senate, and I said, probably not. I said, I need some time to think about it, but I just came out of a very important process. And I said to him, one of the factors is that this is this is 2015, and I've just enjoyed a 30-year career as a judge, and a 9-year, almost 8 years, sorry, 8 years as the head of the TRC, one of the most important events in my life and perhaps in the lives of the Indigenous community in Canada. And I'm riding a very high wave of support and a sense of accomplishment and achievement. And I can feel the respect that many people have for the work that we did. And you're asking me to go to the Senate? The judges were always the highest level of respected people in Canada, and now you're asking me to go to a place which is just coming out of a huge scandal, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to do that. But we did talk about what it was that he wanted to achieve in the Senate and whether I could accomplish some of that. And I said, well, as I said, I'd like to speak about it with my family and see what they think. So that night we had a meeting of the family. I brought them all together. We had dinner. All of my children were there, my daughters. I have 4 daughters, and my son, and my eldest granddaughter, who was in Winnipeg, and she was 10 years old at the time. And so we all had a discussion, and I said, no, I want to go around the table, and I want to ask each of you what you think. And so they all talked about their concerns about my health, their concerns about the impact of carrying on public life, considering all the work that I'd done, their concerns about the impact on my wife and their mother. And so ultimately they all said, it's really up to Mom to decide. And so I said, I agree. So I turned to my wife and I said, so what do you think? Do you think I should accept this? And she looked at me for about 30 seconds. And I knew that what she was going to say was very important. And she said to me, well, you've been retired for 8 days now. And you've reorganized the coverage 3 times and I can't find a damn thing. I was thinking of asking you to get a part-time job just to get you out of the house because this is my territory. And so maybe you should try it for a while and see what you can do. So that's the reason that I accepted the appointment, as well as, of course, what I had hoped to accomplish while I was there. And then, of course, another little story coming out of that I want to share with you is that my granddaughter, who was there, after the dinner was over, she said, Mushum, that means grandfather in our language, Mushum, she said, could you come to school with me tomorrow? And I want to tell my classmates that now you're going to the Senate. And I said, okay, but I want you to introduce me. And she's a fine little public speaker. She's now won a number of public speaking awards. And so she said, sure. So I went with her to her class the next day, and there's about 30 or 40 students in the classroom. And it was show and tell, incidentally. That's why I was there. And so then she talked about my career. She knew a lot about my career as a lawyer and as a judge, and of course the work of the TRC. She was present at most of the events of the TRC, and was quite familiar with the residential school story and things like that. And then at the end of it, she said, and now he's a senator. And then she sat down. So that was my cue to start. So I stood up. But in the meantime, this young boy puts up his hand, little boy, it looked like he was about 10, put up his hand and he said, what does a senator do? And so Sarah, my granddaughter, she gets up and she steps forward and looks right at that boy for about 30 seconds. So she's mastered her grandmother's trick. So I knew what was coming out of her mouth was going to be important. And she looked at him. She put her hands on her hips during that whole time. And then she turned and looked at me. And at that moment, I realized that she had no idea. But again, in typical style of her grandmother, she turned back to that little boy and she said simply, "He sanitizes." So that wasn't in the job description that I accepted, but it is part of, I think, part of the approach that we have to take now to what it is that we're faced with in the Senate. I want to begin by apologizing really to all of you for not being able to be there. I came down with flu-like symptoms on Monday or Tuesday, and so I went to go see my doctor, and because of the amount of travel that I do and the fact that I was recently in the United States and in one of the hot spots for the coronavirus, he said, before you travel anywhere, I want you to go through some tests. And so that's when I called Mr. Curtis and said, I'm not sure, Bruce, that I can come. So we did the tests and everything's been cleared up, but I still have the flu symptoms and couldn't really travel in any event because they're pretty serious. And I'm hoping that I can finish this without having to throw up in a garbage pail here or run to the bathroom all of a sudden. But I appreciate the accommodation that you made for my being able to deliver this lecture to you. So let's talk about the TRC calls to action. And I know that that one of the things that we were going to talk about tonight was kind of where are we now? Where's the calls to action, and what's the status of them? And can we say that we're really moving? And if so, are we moving fast enough? Are we doing enough in all these areas? Excuse me. So on that point, I think that people need to keep in mind something that I said on the last day of the TRC, and that is that getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation is going to be much harder. It's going to be much harder because we not only are calling upon individuals to begin to look at themselves and beginning to look at what they have come to believe about their country and beginning to look at the way they've been educated and beginning to question their motives and their knowledge and their own unhidden or hidden and unconscious racism, which is all very difficult to do. But we're also calling upon major institutions in the country to change the way they do business. We called upon governments and churches and education systems and police systems, the justice system, the child welfare system, the medical system, all to begin to look seriously at what it is they were doing and to recognize that what they might be doing, while they might think it's the best thing, and in fact it may be the best thing for everybody, it may not be in the best interest of Indigenous people to keep doing it, to keep doing things that way. And so our calls to action were based upon that approach, to try to analyze the way the system was working, the implications of what they're doing, founded upon the experience of the past, and to ask ourselves, can they do it better, or can they do it differently in a way that creates better results? And or should the system, in fact, continue doing what it's doing and continue on the road that they're doing? And so we took a very general approach in that way. We didn't specify any particular individuals, with the possible exception of the governments and the churches. But we did take a serious look at that kind of an institutional approach to the calls to action. And most people, when they ask me, like, how are things going with the calls to action, I say, well, one of the first challenges we placed out there, and people tend to forget this, one of the first actions we called upon all of Canada to do was to read the report, or to read the summary of the report. And I know that the report, the full report itself, is over 6,000 pages, so I didn't have any hope that anybody else was going to read it. I had to in order to write it, but the summary of the report is only 400 pages long, and it's got about 140 pages of appendices. But and I think it's a very readable document. I think it's a very useful document. But most people haven't read even the summary of the TRC report. And so we commissioned the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to actually do a summary of the summary. So there's a 104-page summary of the summary, which we hoped people would read. And I think many people have still not read that. And part of it is because, they may feel that they were inundated with so much information during the TRC process that they know enough to be able to move. But the one thing that's difficult about relying on that is that memories fade and people pass away, and with them go those memories and go those recollections. And so we felt it was important, and still feel it's important, to try to get the summary of the TRC report into the educational system in a fuller way, particularly at the post-secondary level. Universities and colleges and even high schools should be utilizing it in some way. But having said that, the 94 calls to action were also quite low in number. If any of you ever read other commissions of inquiry, you'll know that many commissions of inquiry issue reports that have hundreds and hundreds of calls to action. I participated in the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba back in 1990, and we issued a report that had 389 recommendations. So it was like a study in micromanaging the justice system. And most of those were never implemented because it didn't have support from the provincial government, and therefore there was never any plan put in place to implement it, beyond a few of the more public approaches and public things that the government wanted to be able to showcase as their support for the AJI's work. But still a large part of the work of the justice system still remains to be done. One of the major findings we had made in the AJI report was that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the jails of this country at a rate of about 8 times their presence in the population. And now when you look at the statistics, that rate has actually gone up. Even though the federal government amended the criminal code, as those of you working in the field of transformative justice will know, that the criminal code was amended in 1996 to call upon the judges to reduce the use of incarceration, and before utilizing incarceration where Aboriginal offenders are concerned, to take into account the unique circumstances of Aboriginal people. But still, Aboriginal people now are overrepresented in the jails of our country, probably at a rate of close to 12 times their presence in the population. In Manitoba, as an example, Aboriginal people represent about 12%, 15% by some estimates of the provincial population. But 72% of the men incarcerated in jails in Manitoba are Indigenous men. About 77% of the youth who are incarcerated are Indigenous kids, and over 90% of the women who are incarcerated are Indigenous women. And that's just an indication that the system is still failing. And it's failing because the principles of reformative justice that the amendment in 1996 called upon the courts to consider are not being well used. Despite the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions in Gladue and Ipoli, the principles around reformative justice are not well funded within the justice system, and they're not well approached. And so as a result, the system continues to fail. But having said all of that, just let me run briefly through and remind you a bit about what's in the calls to action. So of the 94 calls to action, the first 42 are what we call legacy calls, that is calls to action which were intended to focus upon the impact of residential schools or the impact of cultural oppression over the years, and calls to action which were intended to address those impacts. So we have calls to action which deal with the justice system, which deal with the child welfare system, which deal with medical treatment, medical services, which deal with social programming and the like. We also talk about programs to deal with anticipated high suicide rates. Suicide rates have gone up even since the TRC report among Indigenous youth. And so the reality is that the situation is getting worse in Indigenous Canada than even when the TRC issued its report. So it's getting more and more critical. And at the same time, one of the things we pointed out then is that the growing number of young Indigenous people who are seeking to know their history, to know their culture, to know their language is increasing. And so the demand for schools to be providing language instruction to Indigenous kids is not just coming from the parents, it's also coming from the children, the young students who want it. The demand for recognition of educational content which recognizes their cultures, their histories, their stories is coming from the students. And the failure of the educational system to respond to their needs and their wishes is resulting in continually high dropout rates and failure rates in the school system. And so it's not surprising that we see the legacy issues that we talked about in the TRC report continuing. But the first 42 calls to action then are intended to deal with those and address solutions that are focusing on those things. The calls to action 42 to 47 deal with the issue of reconciliation and how reconciliation should be viewed and how it should work and what it's about. And what we point out is that reconciliation is not a term that we should be using in an inappropriate way. Even before the end of the TRC process was completed, we found, for example, that governments at all levels and other institutions too would do something that they would normally do, but now they would call it an act of reconciliation. So when governments established, the federal government, for example, established in 2013 or so, 2015, a program to fund legal aid programs for Indigenous people in other parts of in the remote parts of the country. They said it was a gesture of reconciliation, but that's something they should have been doing without there being any reference to the TRC report. It's just the system had been so badly underfunded to begin with. So reconciliation is really about taking a look at the relationship that we now have and taking a look at the kind of relationship we want to have and taking steps to make that relationship, that latter relationship, achievable and achieved. And so it's all about relationship. It's not about simply pointing to something I did today, which makes things better, or something that I did yesterday that shows that I'm a good guy. It is about having a plan of action that will be a permanent plan, that will be an enforceable plan. One of the things that I've criticized the federal government about, and my nephew, Justin Trudeau, I call him nephew because I told him when we first met that his mother was named Sinclair and that she was my cousin and therefore he was my nephew. But I told him one time, I said, the biggest failure of the federal government when it comes to implementing the calls to action is that you don't have a plan. You don't have a plan that includes calling upon and requiring the civil servants who are carrying out government programming to actually be held to account for what they're doing. And because of that, it's business as usual for most of them. And if you had a plan and the requirement that the plan be carried out, and even better yet, if you paid their bonuses based upon their ability to achieve that plan, then I think you'd see a lot of change. But that hasn't been done. And so the lack of plan is the real significant holdback when it comes to the federal government. And they've done a few things, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And when you look at the letters of mandate, there's an effort there to give direction to cabinet ministers to focus on certain things that come out of the calls to action. But the one thing that I said is that there should be some kind of cabinet directive to every senior manager within the civil service that their jobs depend upon reconciliation being achieved. And reconciliation won't necessarily be achieved in our lifetimes, but reconciliation can be moved further forward if people actually make an earnest and concerted effort. And back in the day when the government under Sir John A. Macdonald was deciding that they were going to do something about the Indian problem in the West, they gave very clear instructions to their civil servants that they had to do something. And they had to do this, and they were given very clear marching orders that this was expected of them, that they couldn't disagree with government policy in this area. And government policy in this area was that we have to deal with Indigenous people in this particular way. And so every civil servant working on the ground in Western Canada took it upon themselves to do that. And we're not seeing that among the civil servants. There's lots of civil servants who'd like to do that, but they're not getting the support they feel they need from their managers and their ADMs and their deputy ministers. So there's a lot of work around reconciliation that still needs to be done. Calls to action 48 and 49 talk about the Residential School Settlement Agreement, but also talks about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And what we said was that and I think this is probably a deliberate misinterpretation, but many people say that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples cannot become a federal law in and of itself because there's a lot of provincial jurisdiction there. Well, first of all, some United Nations documents which intrude on federal law and provincial law can be enacted by the federal government. Migratory Birds Convention Act is probably an example of that. But more importantly, The UN declaration, it's not in that category of conventions and agreements, international agreements that are required to be passed through implemented through federal legislation. What we said was that it should be adopted by the federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments, and business entities and churches as a framework for reconciliation. So when you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it contains a number of principles that people should be prepared to adopt, and it contains a number of steps that governments and other institutions should be taking and could be taking whenever they're in a situation dealing with Indigenous people or Indigenous rights. And so what we said is that's the framework for reconciliation. If you want to know how to achieve reconciliation, seriously look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and make that happen. And make that happen within your sphere of influence and obligations and responsibilities. So we haven't seen that yet, but the UN Declaration itself was part of a bill that was passed in the House of Commons. But even that bill, all it said was for the federal government to look at which of its laws are not consistent with the UN Declaration and to consider doing an inventory within a certain period of time. So even that bill, as good as it was, as major a step as it was, still didn't try to force the UN Declaration into becoming a federal law. And people have, I think, deliberately misunderstood that. Calls to action 50 to 52 deal with equity and legal system. And that has to do with the way the justice system is operating and the fact that the issue of tribal courts, for example, was never really accepted in the report of the AJI or in some of the other justice reports that were done. Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia all did studies around the same time as the AJI. All did studies into the justice system in their various provinces. And most of them had something to say about tribal courts and the fact that Indigenous people should be allowed to run their own court system, utilizing their own laws and legal principles within their territories, within their reserves, if they're established on reserves, or within their territories, because that's a simple right of governance. You can't be a government unless you have a justice system that you operate. Calls to action 53 or 56 talk about the need to establish a National Council for Reconciliation. That's a body that we felt was very important because reconciliation and the steps toward it, it's going to need some kind of oversight, and that we felt if you leave it totally in the hands of the federal government, they'll proceed at their own pace, and that's what we're seeing now. But if you establish a body that is represented by the Indigenous, has representation from the Indigenous people, the other parties to the settlement agreement, including survivors, and other entities, then that council would have a responsibility to report regularly on what the governments are doing, not just the federal, but the provincial as well, and what the other entities who are given some responsibilities under the calls to action to do things are actually doing. So the National Council for Reconciliation has not yet been established. There's an advisory committee that's been established to look into how to do it, but this is 5 years later, and if you can't figure that out by now, then I wonder when they'll be able to get to it. Call to action 57 calls upon the need for there to be training of all public servants as part of their professional development about the history of residential schools, the history of cultural oppression, and the way that the government has acted in the past towards Indigenous people and may continue to be acting in the past based upon those same beliefs and those same policies, and to allow the civil servants to begin to look at their policies to see how many of them, or if any of them, are still founded upon some of those old ideas and those old systems, which we now know to be quite racist. And we can't say that there's been much done in that area. I can tell you that I've spoken at a lot of professional development days, but there's never any follow-up. There's never any effort made to explain what the departments are doing about that. And we still hear from Indigenous people working in government departments that they still feel there's a lot of misunderstanding and even outright racism by civil servants towards Indigenous people. And so that's an ongoing cause for concern. In calls to action 58 to 61, we call upon the churches to issue their apologies. And we recognized in that section that gave rise to those calls to action that most of the Protestant churches, all of the Protestant churches, in fact, that were parties to the settlement agreement, had issued apologies for their involvement in the residential schools. The Catholic Church had not, and we called upon them to issue an appropriate apology. There have been various apologies by different segments of the Catholic Church or different bishops and archbishops, but the church itself as an entity has not issued an apology. And what's interesting is that Pope Francis issued a full and very sincere apology to the Indigenous people of South America for what the church did there, and yet can't find the way to do that for Canada. And that troubles me, because I think it could easily be done here, and it would have a lot of meaning to a lot of Indigenous people, because 72% of the church, 72% of the residential schools in Western Canada were run by the Catholic Church, and most of the survivors, and in particular the survivors who were abused in residential schools run by the church. So they have a significant role to play. And I know it has to do with their sense of exposure to liability in other legal actions that are being brought. But I think any issue around that would have been dealt with the Pope Francis apology to South America's Indigenous people. Calls to action 62 to 65 talk about the importance of education and reconciliation. In fact, it led to our statement that education and changes that need to be made to the educational system is the key to reconciliation. And the reason why we said that was because the way we educate our children and what we teach them about history, what we teach them about Indigenous people, what we teach them about non-Indigenous people who come here from Europe, is probably the leading cause of misunderstanding, bad relationships, and bullying and racism in Canada. Because in the public schools, as well as the residential schools, Indigenous people were told that they were inferior, that they were heathens, they were pagans, that they didn't have a right to maintain their culture, their languages. In the public schools, that same message was taught. But in the public schools, the added factor was that the glory of European colonizers and settlers was part of the picture as well. And as a result, the myth of European superiority and Indigenous inferiority became part of the message, and it was very problematic. So we called upon the schools to start changing their curriculum. Educational systems that are run by the provinces need to look at curriculum changes significantly, but that's been very slow coming. again, it's been 5 years. You would have thought that by now there would be some major changes, but there have been minor changes, and a lot of it has come about because some schools themselves are taking the bull by the horns, literally, and doing something. But the departments of education are still, many of them are saying they're still studying this. In Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, they're actively implementing significant changes to their educational systems and their material, their educational material and curriculum materials. But they found early on that there was a lack of appropriate materials, so they sometimes had to create some. But having said all of that, it varies across the country. And in Quebec, they've declined to do anything about the curriculum, but other parts of the country are struggling with it. There's no consistent effort yet that I think is going to result in the kind of change that we pointed out needed to be undertaken. And Call to Action 66, we talked about the need for youth programs that supported Indigenous kids, Indigenous youth in their efforts outside of school to stay involved, to get involved in safe activities and to be allowed to develop their interest in social affairs and public affairs, and that's not being done at a fulsome level yet. In Calls to Action 67 to 70, we talked about the need for museums and archives to take a look seriously at what they've got in their holdings and to consider following the internationally accepted policy of repatriating to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities those items that they are holding which are of sacred importance to those communities and those peoples. You'll hear, if you follow the newspapers, you'll know that in the United States they have the Indigenous Cultural Repatriation Act that was passed some time ago, which requires archives and museums to return articles at the demand of the community or the family that's involved. Many museums in Canada are trying to do that. I know the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature developed a policy early on of repatriating, but not everybody's done that yet, and I think there still needs to be a more coherent policy and implementation of that across the country. But it's one of those that is pretty significantly underway, and I think we can hold hope that it's actually going to be done. In Calls to Action 77 to 78, we call upon the parties to create the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to continue the work and become the archive for the collection of documents that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission developed. That was done. It's now housed at the University of Manitoba. It has its growing pains, but I think overall it's probably fulfilling most of what we expected from the settlement agreement and the calls to action when we created that. In the Calls to Action 79 to 81, we called upon the governments in particular, but entities across the country to consider putting up commemoration markers for acknowledging what was done with regard to residential schools. We called upon the federal government in particular to establish a national monument for residential schools to represent the impact upon the Indigenous community, the role of government, and the ongoing legacy of residential schools and survivors. And so far, we're not anywhere close to doing anything in that area yet. Calls to Action 84 to 86 talked about the media. We talked about funding the CBC to give it more of an ability to report on Indigenous stories. And I think it's one media outlet that's really making significant inroads. APTN as well has really been able to utilize the TRC report and the focus of the calls to action upon their work. And I think we're seeing two very important media outlets doing work in that area, but the rest of them still have a ways to go yet, particularly the written media. But I think the written media is probably under significant downsizing, and social media is now becoming the outlet of choice for informing many people, and as a result, there's very little controls on it. And this was an area that that we did not take into account when we issued that call to action, the growing role of social media. And so I think we still need to think about how we can utilize that in a safer way and put some regulatory mechanism on social media so that the amount of racism that we now see, which is manifested through social media, can be better controlled. Call to action 87 to 91 talks about the important role of sports and the legacy that sports have in many Indigenous communities, and the fact that most Indigenous children have a sport and athletic interest of some kind, but are unable to carry it out very successfully because they don't have the resources, they don't have the programming, they don't have the coaching, and they would be able to achieve some of their personal goals and achieve some personal success and community success as well if those were taken care of. And in Calls to Action 92, we talked about business, the important role of corporations, and also the growing importance of Indigenous business in the Indigenous communities. The number one employer of Indigenous people in First Nations communities is almost always local businesses, small businesses, but their influence is quite significant. And as a result of that, the money stays within the community. But when you have outside employers coming in and profiting from the sales of goods within the community, that profit goes out and it doesn't benefit the community other than perhaps through the salaries. And Calls to Action 93 and 94 talk about the importance of addressing the fact that more and more people are coming to Canada from countries and parts of the world that don't have an awareness of this history. They're not connected to it, but also that they may come with their own biases because of their own colonial experience and their teachings about the grandeur of their colonizer, and therefore, and they may also have misunderstandings about who Indigenous people are and what Indigenous people stand for. And so what we said is that newcomers need to be given a short course on Indigenous peoples of Canada, colonialism, residential schools, and that when they swear allegiance to Canada, that they also swear allegiance to uphold the treaty and Aboriginal rights of Indigenous peoples. And those have not yet been done. So that's a brief run through the calls to action and where things are at. There are some that are underway and still have a ways to go. So you've heard, for example, undoubtedly about the Indigenous Languages Law that was passed by the Government of Canada last year, but it hasn't yet found its feet, and so its impact is unknown, and what limitations might be placed upon it through lack of funding is also going to be a big question, because the government spent a lot of money in establishing residential schools to take the language away, but they are not as eager to spend an equivalent amount of money in today's dollars to restore and help Indigenous people to restore languages to their communities. But the commitment is there. The recognition of Indigenous languages as a right of Indigenous people is stated, and so our call to action, which called for that, has been implemented, but the remainder of it to fund appropriate programs for Indigenous language is yet to be seen. And all of the calls around the changes to the justice system, the child welfare system, and others, I think there's a lot of work to do. The bottom line is that, as I said at the outset, getting to the truth was hard. Getting to reconciliation is going to be harder. I've said before that I do not expect to see reconciliation. I do not expect to see the kind of relationship that we talk about in the TRC report within my lifetime. I don't even expect that it will occur within the lifetime of my children. But with each generation, we have to keep moving in that direction. We have to acknowledge that reconciliation is about establishing a relationship of mutual respect and a recognition of each other's rights to exist in accordance with our own wishes, and that what we do between now and the moment that that might happen, or the time that that comes about, is that we need to measure everything we do against the question of, is this going to achieve a better relationship? And that's important. But the other thing that I said was also important is that before we can get to mutual respect, which is what that calls for, before we can get to mutual respect, we also have to recognize that we have an obligation to give to Indigenous youth their self-respect, because for a long time, this country has spent a lot of time, effort, energy, and money to do away with the Indigenous youth sense of identity. And that's one area where they can probably claim some major success out of residential schools, is that there are lots of Indigenous youth who simply don't know who they are and don't know what their history is and don't know what their cultures are, which is what they really want in life. So with that, I'm going to end my remarks and leave it to the moderator to now lead us into a question and answer period. Thank you.
Just while we're setting up the microphones for the questions, I thought I would mention to you that out in the front lobby, there is a small pocket-sized book which has all 94 calls to action plus the entire transcript of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. And you are welcome to take a copy or two with you and share, read, study, and maybe that will inspire you to read the summary of the summary. And it's a really good read, so that might inspire you to read the summary. And then, if you're heading into the summer and looking for something to read on the beach, the 6,000 pages of the full report are well worth your attention. So I'd like to call on Doug Killian, who is going to be moderating our question period.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And may I just say that it's a privilege to humbly and gratefully stand on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation and in the presence of Mary Sinclair. I would like to thank Senator Sinclair for his remarks this evening. They're insightful and informative and have significantly added to the remarkable legacy of the Campagnolo lectures. The Senator has graciously allowed time for audience questions on the subject of his talk this evening, and I'll MC that and help make it happen for everyone. Because of the wide range of issues that flow out of the 94 calls to action, there's considerable scope for questions. When we call for questions, please come up to the mic that is just to the your left of the stage, and you'll be given an opportunity to pose a short question. This will ensure that all may hear the question, and so it is recorded as part of the video of this event. Your patience is appreciated, and this procedure will ensure that we all enjoy and learn from the conversation. So if anyone would like to come up, we'll welcome you to come up just now.
I'm Steve Farrer Ramadan, and I want to thank the Senator for coming and speaking and educating so many people here, myself particularly today. My question is, could you talk a little bit about the Prime Minister's commitment to this, to the recommendations, and then maybe more importantly, to some extent, what would you recommend citizens can do so to have an impact on this, so that it isn't going to be the end of not your life or your grandchildren's, etc., but a hell of a lot before that, so these get done? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's very pertinent. Excuse me for coughing. I think the Prime Minister is well-intentioned. He made a very bold statement during the 2015 election of implementing the calls to action and the work of the TRC, and I think he genuinely wants to do that. However, the reason I said that reconciliation is going to be harder is because there are many conflicting demands upon society and many conflicting expectations about where our society should go. And one of them obviously is the economy and the potential impact of the calls to action on the economy, and understanding that there doesn't need to be a negative impact on the economy by carrying out the calls to action. They very much can go hand in hand. And those who've read the report will know that we discussed that very thoroughly in the TRC report, that the economy will benefit when healthy communities are created, and when Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people learn how to be partners in the fullest sense of the word. So, having said all of that, there are voices out there, and I'm sure, including among his advisors, who are not particularly focused upon the TRC calls to action, but are focused upon other priorities. And so it tends to pull you aside, it tends to make you make decisions, and I'm sure this is part of the issue, that will not take into account the impact upon the path to reconciliation. And that's why the lack of a plan for reconciliation, I think, is the biggest problem right now that the Prime Minister is facing. And if he had a plan, or if the government had a plan about how to achieve reconciliation, then everything they do, including economic development matters, would be measured against whether it helps meet the plan. Okay? So the second part of your question is, what can we do? What can ordinary citizens do? And what I say is, first of all, read the damn report. Okay, I've said that many times, and I keep saying that to people: read the report. But in addition to that, one of the things that I tell people is, don't assume that you need to take on everything that the report talks about. So you don't need to try to do something about justice, and try to do something about education, try to do something about child welfare, try to do something about the economy, or try to do something about businesses, or try to do something about the housing situation. I think you should take a look at all of the calls to action and ask yourself, where can I help? Where can I help? Where is my strength, and what can I do for any one of these calls to action? Maybe you're involved in sports, for example, and you might be able to volunteer in your local Indigenous community, or with your local Indigenous group of kids. There's a local school that has an Indigenous population, and help the kids organize some sporting activity, or help get them involved in some sporting activity, or perhaps raise funds to get equipment for the schools up north that don't have equipment. The former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Lieutenant Governor Bartleman, he decided that one of the things he was going to do to advance reconciliation was he was going to go to all of the people that he knew to get them to donate books to libraries and Indigenous schools in the north, because most schools on reserves in northern Canada, not just Ontario, but Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, UB, and BC, most of those reserve schools don't have libraries. And so kids who want to read things don't have access to books. So whatever it is that you can do, even simple things like one of the mothers of one of our honorary witnesses, Clara Hughes, Clara's mother, when she asked Clara, what is it that I can do to help? Clara told her what I had said, which is do whatever you can. So her mother decided that she had a group of friends of her age, so they called themselves tea grannies. They used to get together every couple of weeks just to have tea together. And so there would be a group of about 7 or 8 or 10 of them, and they would get together and just talk about things, and particularly talk about their families. But so she said at one of their meetings, she said to them, "This is important. Let's talk about the TRC." And so they got a copy of the summary report, and they started reading it one page at a time, literally, until they got through much of it. And then they said they decided at a certain point that they were going to do something about each of those calls to action. So what they did was they assigned each other responsibility to call a government minister, or to call their church minister, or to call somebody in the city office to say, what are you doing about this? This is a call to action. What are you doing about it? So they became an organized citizen's voice. And so that was something that they thought was important, and that's something that they thought they could do. And they also educated themselves in the meantime, because most of them didn't know anything about this, and that was important. But I'll tell you a little story that came out of that. Was at these tea grannies, they used to bring their children and grandchildren sometimes, and one of them brought her granddaughter to one of these events, and her granddaughter was about 18 years old and was about 8 months pregnant, and they played a video of one of my speeches at this event, just to learn about the TRC and what was going on. And at the end of it, they talked about the video and what they'd learned from it. And she told me, this is Clara Hughes' mother, told me that at the end of it, this young woman, young mother-to-be, said, "Oh, I just loved that speech by Justice Sinclair. I thought it was amazing, and I'm so moved by it. I think that he's doing important work, and I think in honor of him, I'm going to name my child after him, because you're going to have a little boy. I'm going to name my little child after him." And so she did. So Clara's mother says that when she gave birth to her little boy, she named her little boy after me. And so in Winnipeg now, there's a little boy called Justice, named after me. So we can do lots of things. You can do it at a major level if you have that level of responsibility or authority or influence, or you can do it at the minor level, to the community level. But one of the things that I encourage people to do is think about reaching out to Indigenous people you know, just to get to know them a little better. I think that's important. Establish friendships.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. Next question, please.
Thanks very much for sharing your time and your energy. I'm sure this is past your bedtime when you're not feeling well, but thanks for hanging in with us. It seems that most of us
Wayne,
need...
could you give us your name, please?
My name's Wayne Bradley. I live in the Comox Valley. Most of us need a whack on the nose to get our attention, to even start to pay attention to what the issues are. It's kind of like, walking through the tall grass and stepping on a rake. And we just stepped on the Wet'suwet'en rake. And if your nose doesn't hurt, you're not paying attention. Ellen Gabriel just made a speech. She was one of the matriarchs behind the line in Oka 20 years ago. Probably presented a full-blown massacre there. She just said, reconciliation isn't going to happen until the mainstream of Canadian society acknowledges that there is Indigenous law, that it's real, that it governs people's lives today, and that we get down to integrating Indigenous law with the mainstream Canadian law. So I'd like you to comment on that. The Wet'suwet'en have really banged us on the head and said, you're violating our laws, and most of us never realized there were such laws. So how do we approach that, and how do we as individuals go about coming to grips with an understanding of what Indigenous law is, where we live, and how we work it into the functioning of our society where we live?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And incidentally, this is a 3-hour lecture that I usually deliver to law schools. So I'm going to try to cut it down to a couple of minutes. The one thing people need to get past is this belief that that Indigenous people were so inferior and so backwards that they didn't have laws, that they just lived helter-skelter and chaotic existence, and that it was Europeans that brought them focus and a civilization, that up until then they were so uncivilized that they didn't even have laws. That was a common teaching in the public schools of this country and even within the law schools. And so the lack of validity of Indigenous people extended to the lack of validity of their being able to develop laws. But I challenged people on that right at the beginning of my work as a judge, in fact, and I said, listen, according to anthropologists and archaeologists, they accept that Indigenous people have been in this part of the world for at least 15,000 years. Now, most archaeologists are able to accept that there's evidence of Indigenous populations in Southwest United States that go back as far as 75,000 years ago. But that Indigenous people have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they've been living in organized societies. They had to in order to stay alive. They had to live in villages. They had to live in communities. I said, what makes you think that they could live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years together without having some rules? Laws are nothing more than rules, you know. We call them laws, but that's just a fancy way of saying rule. It's a rule of conduct that we expect people to follow. And so then there are consequences for not following the rules. Everybody has rules. Every society has rules. Indigenous people had rules, and those rules are laws because they were endorsed by the people. And so we need to understand that Indigenous people did have laws, and they governed themselves by those laws. And they had laws that governed the internal operation of the community, but they also had laws and legal principles about how they interacted with other neighboring tribes. Because if they didn't have them, then there would be constant misunderstanding between them, and they'd be constantly at war. So they had to develop those relationships. They had to develop an understanding about how those relationships were going to work. So there were laws. And what kind of laws were they is usually the next question. Well, what kind of laws does a society need? We need to have laws around child rearing. We need to have laws around marriage. We need to have laws around separation. We need to have laws around property. So, for example, you can't just come and crawl into my teepee because you're sleepy. It's my teepee, and you can't come in there. So that's a law. And if you do, they have a right to kick you out. There are laws around everything that had to do with the survival of the community, the survival of the tribe. You've all, in British Columbia, you've all come to be aware of the importance of the potlatch laws. Those were in place long before the arrival of Europeans. And those potlatch laws are important to understand about what they do, what they accomplish, and why they're there. And because they're part of their governance system. You know that Wet'suwet'en, when they signed the agreement with the government just a few days ago, said, we cannot discuss what we agreed to until we have a feast with the people. And the people agree at the feast that this is acceptable. And so that's part of their laws, it's part of their tradition. And every tribe has traditions and laws like that. And you can't continue to think that Indigenous people didn't have laws. Now, the question becomes, where are the laws now? Well, they were so totally oppressed for the last 150 years by the Canadian government that some have been forgotten. But there are still sources for finding and reviving those laws because many of them are still followed, even unconsciously, by Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. And so, you know, I can remember being raised by my grandmother, who went to a residential school and was raised as a Catholic. But there were certain things that she did, and there were certain things that she said, and certain things that occurred within our household that were clearly reflective of what I know now are the traditional laws of our people. So, you know, as one example, in the household, my grandfather absolutely recognized her authority and recognized the authority of all the women in the community. And because we were a matriarchal society, even though in 1891, the right of Indigenous women to run their communities was taken away by Canadian law. But still, whenever they would have a community meeting where I grew up, it was always the women who made those decisions. So, yeah, we had laws. We have lots of them. And now we need to put them into place and start using them for ourselves. And it's in one of the calls to action. And so when you take a look at it, one of the things we say is that Indigenous legal institutions need to be put in place to assist communities to find their laws and to put them into form where they can be used in this day and age.
Dr. Sinclair, Senator Sinclair, Ijaiwa, Aikwanisilam Nama. My Comox name is Namuguis. My English name is Richard Hardy, Council with the Comox First Nation. Just a couple of comments for you in regards to our politicians and keeping them accountable in regards to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. A comment that you made during your presentation revolved around senior bureaucrats and staff below them still not walking the way they're talking in regards to what politicians are saying. I totally and wholeheartedly agree with you. Being on council for the last year, I've seen this. My other comment to you was in regards to, you made reference to your nephew, Mr. Justin Trudeau. He was instrumental in getting you to sit on this Senate. I'm just wondering, in regards to the report that you did, and my commitment to you will be to read that report, all 6,000 pages. My question to you is in regards to, I know that report now is coming up on just over or close to 5 years. Has there been, or will there be, a progress report that goes back to your nephew in regards to what items that you've made reference to in the action items being dealt with or worked on. And again, as I finish up, thank you very much for all the work that you've done for Indigenous peoples and for Canadians. The amount of time and effort that you've put in, the sacrifices that your family have made for you to do the work that you've done, I don't think enough of us say thank you for that work. So again, thanks. Aichka.
The short answer is yes. This is the 5th year anniversary of the release of the report of the TRC, and I don't know what the government is planning on doing, but I know that there are a group of us, including the former commissioners, who are planning on doing something. And one of the things that we will be doing is we will be presenting our assessment of where things stand. And if you want a kind of a snapshot of the various calls to action and where they're currently at, I recommend to you to go to a website called indigenouswatchdog.org and read the blog that is maintained by my cousin, Doug Sinclair, in which he analyzes each of the calls to action. And he then has a chart which shows which ones are being done, which ones are completed, which ones are stalled. And I think it's a worthwhile read for everybody. And when people ask me, where are things at, I always encourage them to go and take a look at that, because he's doing a very good job of reporting out, and you can subscribe to his newsletter. He'll report out on a regular basis to anybody who asks what's happening with each of the calls to action. And so that is something that we will do as well. Is at the end of the day, we will publicly comment upon where we things are at, why we think things are not proceeding at a proper pace if they're not, or if they're proceeding as we expected, and what we think needs to be done.
Gela Kessler, Hetman Gligami Cam Okerboyer. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, Senator Sinclair. I was wondering, as a recently graduated student, with the new curriculum, Indigenous inclusive curriculum changes that have arrived in many of the schools here, something that I witnessed firsthand quite often was backlash from the teachers. And I was wondering how students can address these issues with higher-ups in a way that won't be dismissed in a time when having words and actions labeled as having anti-Indigenous roots is seen as worse than these words and actions continuing.
Well, I'll tell you what I told my granddaughter when she said the same thing to me. I said, organize. Get your fellow classmates to stand with you. Doing it on an individual basis is very difficult, but if you organize and take some collective action and speak collectively, I think it's a much stronger front than trying to do it one by one. And I think that also requires that you do more of an in-depth analysis and simply an ad hoc set of stories about this is what I heard and this is what I did and this is what was done to me, and etc. So organize. I think doing things in an organized fashion is always the best way to do it.
Thank you. And if the next person would like to introduce themselves, please.
My name is Fraser Graham. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us, and it's been really
Could you speak more directly to the mic so everybody can hear you,
okay.
please? Thanks.
So thank you for coming to speak to us. It's been really informative, and it's really shown us how much work Canada still needs to do. What steps do you think the Canadian government could take to support mental health of Aboriginal peoples in northern communities?
That's an important question because the mental health needs of Indigenous youth, in particular Indigenous, by that I'm saying people under the age of 30, is really at the root cause of health problems generally, but also participation in addictive behaviors such as opioids and alcohol, and in some communities they still sniff gasoline. And it has to do with their sense of hopelessness, their sense of disconnection from community, from life, their sense of not feeling like they're going to ever have an opportunity. And so what really is a result of the colonial history and residential school experience has given rise to family situations where parents are unable to give a sense of a future to their own children. And as a result of these children are beginning to feel like they're not really worthy. So getting this knowledge into the hands of the children is a start, but the reality is as well that for the immediate future, I think we really have to look at what is it that is likely to work when it comes to Indigenous youth and their mental health needs. I think it is about finding out what it is that is motivating them to consider suicide, for example, or is causing them to feel the way that they're feeling. And while I think regular psychiatric and psychological treatment is part of the package of treatments that have to be provided, I also think we're overlooking the fact that there is a great need among Indigenous youth today to understand their identity, to understand who they are, to learn about their past, so they want to know the answer to those questions that I always talk about when I talk to teachers, and that is, where do I come from? Where do my people come from? Where are we going? Why am I here? And who am I? Those are common questions. Sociologists write about the fact that this sense of belonging is key to everybody's sense of well-being. And if they don't feel that they belong, then what else have they got? Not very much. And so those questions need to be raised with the young people, and providing them with an opportunity to express themselves and learn about their culture and to be able to express themselves through their culture is really key to their mental health, in my view. And I think it's being overlooked by mental health treatment, where whenever there's a suicide epidemic in some communities, they send in psychiatrists and psychologists and nurses, but they don't send in cultural supports for those children, and I think that's needed as well.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. I'm Darren Blaney, Chief of the Himalco First Nations. The question that I have for you is the impact of the residential schools on governance. As a chief, I deal with a lot of governance in our territory. And one of the things that is very difficult is the economic marginalization by provincial, federal governments of our people. If we're going to heal ourselves from the trauma of residential schools, we have to have access to some of those resources. I know that last year in my territory, there was about 1.2 million cubic meters of timber taken out of my territory. And my community's share of that was 49,000 cubic meters. I know this provincial government funds its roads, highways, hospitals, schools from the forest industry. And I've talked to Scott Fraser many times, and I said to him, you know, you take all the stumpage from the forest in our territory. There's no treaties, there's no agreements, yet you take all those things. I said, if Himalco had a share of that, then we would be able to do our healing. We would be able to work on the traumas in our community. We would be able to address all the social problems in our community. And that's the difficulty, is all that economic marginalization and the oppression of the government to keep us underfunded, because the government is underfunding us. We're still stuck under the 2%. And even in the revenue sharing from forestry, Hamalco's revenue sharing is $212,000 a year. And that's been the same since about 12 years ago when I was chief before. And I looked at it when I came back, and it's still $212,000. So in terms of inflation, we've lost about 65,000. And the purpose of that whole agreement was to close the economic gap and to increase our participation in the forest industry. So there's some lip service to try to improve our conditions by the government. But the economic marginalization is a big factor in our lack of healing. We still have lots of suicides in our community. We have lots of drug problems, alcohol problems, lots of poverty. And that's not by accident. Thank you.
I didn't really detect a question there, but you're going to get a response anyway. So, well, that story is not unusual. It's one that we hear all across the country. And let me commend to you a section of the commission, the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which talks about the need to change the financial relationship between tribes and First Nations communities and the federal government, and that the financial arrangements relationship that needs to be put in place should be more similar to the relationship that provinces enjoy with the federal government, as opposed to simply being on a grant basis. So that means that the recognition that certain resource rights are in the hands of the First Nations people and can't be taken out without there being some proper compensation to Indigenous people is part of that. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report very clearly talked about that, and we endorsed that in our report.
Thank you. My name is Jan Gladish. I'm a member of the Heiltsuk Nation from the House of Chief Wikupawakas. I wanted to just give you a little bit of a report on my work in the field of reconciliation, even before this TRC began. I began as a young teacher in the classroom and in the hallways, and now in my community work. I feel like as an Indigenous woman, I'm always sort of called on to answer questions and, say what's really going on with the Tzo'utin people. And it's very, very draining. I feel like I should almost start calling myself, a warrior granny. It's very, very exhausting. Is there some kind of source of, support for people like me in the community who get drained and worn down by always having to be the answer to all our Indigenous kinds of, unknowns to people who have no clue? It's just really frustrating. It's more of a commentary than a question, but I just wanted to report that to you. And now that I'm retired, I'm supposed to be, rested. I'm not. I'm still working hard. That's my comment, Senator. Thank you.
Well, it's a little hard for me to give you any advice about that, because that's exactly my life too. And let me say this, that recognizing the fact that this kind of work is going to have an impact upon your emotions and your sense of self and your ability to carry on in a normal fashion is always one of the dangers of doing this. And when we started the TRC, I had brought the commissioners together as well as the senior staff, and I I said to them, this is going to be difficult work. We're going to be listening to people's stories who are going to be coming from a damaged state, so they may be talking to us in a very angry way. We're also going to be hearing stories that are going to really hurt us emotionally because we'll be able to identify with them. Some of them may, in fact, be people who are known to us. And we have to be ready for that because we can't afford to lose our sense of direction in this work simply because we are overwhelmed by the weight of those stories. And so I instructed the commissioners and the staff to be sure that they each had emotional support, an emotional support team. So they had cultural supports or somebody who they could rely upon at all times and turn to whenever they needed, just to be able to vent. Because sometimes it couldn't be family, sometimes families were affected by it too, but that was important. And I also told them to be sure to put in place a proper medical team and a mental health team so that each of them, if they needed physically to be treated for some ailment that might occur during the report, that they had immediate access and good access to a doctor or a mental health professional to help them deal with those issues. And also to ensure that once those things were in place, that then they devoted themselves to the work. We can't afford to do this on a part-time basis. This has got to be a full-time responsibility for us. And then every once in a while we would check in with each other just to make sure that that was happening. And it was important for them to be able to feel that they could do that. And I recognize that those who are in the front lines, literally, of being called upon by communities or by schools or other institutions to answer their questions sometimes feel like you're talking to a brick wall because you're answering the same questions over and over and over again. And when I speak to corporations, I say to them, one of the things that you have to do is you have to develop your own set of materials so that when people are coming to work for you, you ensure, A, they either have this knowledge ahead of time, or B, that as soon as they've become employed with you, that they get this knowledge so that they're not stumbling around doing something wrong because they were ignorant of the history of this country or the facts of what it was that, the implications of what it was that they were doing. And not every employer has done that yet, but there's still a lot of work there. But I totally sympathize with you. I think the only way that I'll ever be able to retire is to go live as a hermit in the woods and cut off all communication with the rest of the world. So.
Thank you, Senator. And by my reckoning, it's nearly midnight in Manitoba, so we will make this the last question. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Beth Stepple. Thank you so much for everything you've shared and all of your life's work. I'm a descendant of settlers of Irish and Scottish and English descent. And I have a quick comment just to say, if you want my cell phone number for some of those questions that obviously I can't give an Indigenous perspective, but I do feel like it's the work of white settler folks to answer some of these really boring, monotonous, laborious questions that are put on to folks. And I just want to ask you, with all the work that you've done around reconciliation over the years, Dr. Carla Tate and Frida Hewson and other voices from the land protectors of the Wet'suwet'en territory are saying that reconciliation is dead, and I feel them and where they're coming from in that, and I'm just curious your words and your ideas around that. Thank you for your time.
Well, yeah, it's nice jargon to use, I guess, but the reality is that reconciliation doesn't exist until we change the relationship, and we haven't changed the relationship yet. So the real question that I always tell people that they should be asking themselves is, are we doing the right thing? Are we moving in the right direction? And if we're not, what can we do to change that? And until we learn how to ask that question and we learn how to do that analysis ahead of time, we will continually stumble along and we will continually make mistakes. And making those mistakes is acceptable up to a certain point, but we can't continue to do it in a way that causes permanent harm and damage to the relationship. We cannot continue to do things the way we used to do them in the past. It's the first thing we have to stop. And then the second thing is now we have to figure out how we can do it better in the future. And that's the difficult part, because that requires analysis, it requires focus, and it requires some real deep commitment to make sure that people hold to the line. And so it doesn't really concern me that people say that reconciliation is dead because it was never alive or whatever. What really concerns me is if somebody were to say, I'm giving up on reconciliation. That would concern me, because if they do, then what is left?
I'd just like to thank all of the people who came up and posed questions, and to everyone for listening attentively. I'm realizing that as my part of the evening comes to an end, I've referred to you, Senator, as Doctor. I think perhaps the person who was going to name their child after you got it right when they said Justice. I'd now like to invite Bruce Curtis, the Chief Administrator of the Community Justice Center, to bring us to the close of this evening and express our thanks to Senator Sinclair for the 9th Annual Campagnolo Lecture. Bruce.
Thank you, Doug, for handling that question and answer session so skillfully, as you always do. As we come to the close of yet another Campagnolo lecture, I want to express our deep appreciation to Senator Sinclair for his time and gracious acceptance of the invitation to be our 9th annual lecturer. This evening's lecture has enabled us to more deeply review progress on the 94 calls to action against the obvious backdrop of the Wet'suwet'en conflict over the gas pipeline approved to transverse their traditional territory. We hope that the Smithers Agreement of last weekend, if ratified, will clarify and set out the way forward to a final clarification of Aboriginal rights and title. This dispute, together with Senator Sinclair's 94 calls to action, map out some of the territory in which restorative justice can seek to address in our personal lives and our collective lives. And it will extend our conversations in our community about the practice of restorative justice, and that is what the annual lecture series was intended to stimulate. Over the years, we have been exploring the role and impact of restorative justice as it relates to mental health, community engagement, court-based justice, individual growth and development, and the justice system's impact on young people. This evening's presentation has raised important ideas about the renewed place of Canada's place in Canada's task of working for reconciliation with First Nations. By bringing the gifts of restorative justice to bear on the seemingly intractable and myriad issues confronting Canada's future, we will be seeking and taking significant steps toward the creation of a reconciled, safe, inclusive, and genuinely civil society. And now, in appreciation for Senator Sinclair's time and energy in presenting this year's lecture, please join me in expressing again our sincere thanks to the Honourable Dr. Murray Sinclair. And if this has sparked a deeper interest in what you can do to further the work towards a restorative society, let me say that it's not too late to volunteer at the Community Justice Center and/or to make a substantial legacy gift or a financial endowment to our programs. If you'd like to receive advance notification of the 2021 Campagnolo Lecture, please ensure you send your name and an email address to the CJC's email address at cjc@shawbiz.ca with 2021 Campagnolo Lecture in the subject line. And speaking of 2021, it will be the 10th anniversary of the Campagnolo Lectures, and we are planning a huge splash, a very special concert, a very special exhibit at the Comox Valley Art Gallery, and a very special lecture on environmental law and restorative justice by a very influential leading speaker in those areas. As plans are finalized for next year, please keep a watch for information about the dates and timing of the events celebrating the 10th anniversary. This brings to a close the 9th Annual Campagnolo Lecture. Thank you, and Hala Kasla.